Hello, very good day to you. Welcome to your latest Met Office Deep Dive. I'm Alex Burkill, presenter and meteorologist here at the Met Office, and I'm coming to you this Tuesday like we do every Tuesday, bringing you, well, a deep dive into the weather across the UK and a little bit of a look globally as well. I'll be talking for the next 20 or 30 minutes or so. Perhaps some recent deep dives have gone on a fair bit longer than that, but I think today I've got about 20 or 30 minutes worth of information to get through. If this is your first deep dive, where have you been? But welcome along. And if you're a regular viewer, then thanks for coming back. As always, if you enjoy anything that I've talked about today, do hit the like button, share it with anyone else who you think might be interested in it. And do leave a comment too. I will be answering some of the comments later. But let's get going. We've had a lot of weather recently. You'll have no doubt been aware of Storm Éowyn. It was a major feature that came through at the end of last week. And so I want to have a little look back at what it brought. So behind me, I have the satellite imagery from 5 o'clock last Friday morning. Now, I've picked 5 o'clock because this is when we saw some of the strongest winds. Now, Storm Éowyn, like I said, was a major feature. It brought very low pressure across the UK. In fact, we had a pressure reading in Tiree of 941.9 hectopascals. That's the lowest pressure recorded in the UK from any named storm since we started naming them 10 years ago. And as a result, it's no wonder that we saw such strong winds. In the UK, we had gusts of 90 to 100 miles per hour. In the Republic of Ireland, they had a gust of 114 miles per hour. That's their strongest gust ever recorded. And that was around 5 o'clock in the morning. And it may have been due to something called a sting jet. Now, if you watched the Weather Studio Live on Friday with Alex and Aidan, Alex talked a little bit about the sting jet. In case you don't know, you get sting jets in low pressure centres, storms like the one that Storm Éowyn was. And what it is a small, intense burst of strong winds that come down and can lead to really strong damaging winds in excess of 100 miles per hour. And whilst we did have those kind of speeds, whether or not there was actually a sting jet hitting the UK, there is still some debate amongst meteorologists at the moment. And I want to have a little look at that. Just to try and describe, the sting jet happens because around fronts, and particularly near the low pressure centres, you have a warm conveyor belt of air and a cold conveyor. The cold is sinking, the warm's rising, and it's that sinking of the cold conveyor belt air that's pushing down. And as then the rain and the snow is falling and evaporating into that air as well, that cools it even further, and so then the air drops or descends even more quickly, really rapidly, and that leads to this burst of really strong winds. But they only usually last around 2 to 3 hours before they mature out. And so that's quite important, because if we look at around 5 o'clock on Friday morning, when we had that very strong wind on the west coast of Ireland, and you can see the telltale sign in the cloud of what would be a sting jet, in as much as it's wrapping round. Looks a bit like a scorpion's tail, where it gets its name from. But actually, if we look a little bit closer, and in the center of the low, you can see that the clouds actually started to wrap around, and some cloud filling in the center of the low, which suggests actually by this point, if we had had a sting jet occurring, it started to mature by this stage. And so, well, we could have avoided the absolute worst of the strongest winds, because if we just go back a couple of hours, if we go to say, oh, this is the bit that I struggle with the most on these deep dives using this time bar, but if we go back to around midnight, and if we look at the same feature, there's a bit of cloud there, but not much. Really, I think probably if we look at this is about when the sting jet was occurring. And like I said, they only last a few hours before maturing out. So there was a sting jet, or likely to have been a sting jet here, leading to some very strong winds, and then it all headed towards the UK. Unfortunately, well, to some extent, it matured out. And so whilst we still had a really active cold conveyor bursting towards land and bringing some very strong winds, they perhaps weren't quite as intense maybe as we would have seen if the sting jet had developed just a little bit further east than it actually did. There is still some debate as to whether or not we saw a sting jet and where it did develop, but that's my take on it at the moment. Nonetheless, it did bring some very strong winds, damaging winds, and cause many impacts. Now, Storm Éowyn, like I said, was a major feature. There were a couple of fatalities. There was a lot of disruption. We had over 1 million properties in Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland were without power for a time on Friday, and there was a lot of damage to property as well. And these are the kind of things that we want to make people aware of, that they could happen when we have a storm and a system like Storm Éowyn coming through. And it's these reasons that we issue our warnings. This is why we name the storms, to make people aware so that the public and the government and bodies responsible can take action ahead of the system arriving to prevent these kind of things occurring, or to minimize the risk. We can't get rid of it entirely, but we can help minimize the risk of the impacts from the storms. And I want to have a little look at exactly how well we got the message across, because we issued the warnings well in advance of the system coming through. We were talking about it a good 4 or 5 days before the system arrived. In the week ahead, we mentioned the potential track that the low pressure could take and the fact that it could come across the UK. And then on Tuesday, we actually named the storm and we had our warnings updated. And so that's quite a long lead time, and that no doubt helped with getting the message across. Additionally, a few other things and stats that we had pushed out. So obviously we had yellow, amber, and then red warnings. And with these warnings, we can see that we had over 2 million people viewed our warnings page in the run-up to and during Storm Éowyn. So that's a lot of people that we were able to reach out to and get the story across that there was going to be some strong damaging winds. Additionally, other facts. So we had almost 350,000 people viewed our press release talking about the details regarding Storm Éowyn. We had 1,300 mentions from Met Office experts across the various media channels, and we had almost 15 million impressions across all of our social media channels. So that is just evidence that the work that we do with these deep dives, our social content, the videos that we put out, the posts that we put out on Instagram, Twitter or X and other places, TikTok, etc., and the press releases, it's all about making sure that the message is getting across, and we're making sure people are as informed as they can be ahead of the storm arriving and during it, so that they can take actions to keep themselves safe. So these are just some stats to prove that the work that we're doing is helping to get the story across. But let's look elsewhere. Let's move on from Éowyn. So it was a very deep low, like I mentioned, across the UK. We had a reading of 941.9 hectopascals. But if we dart our minds back just to yesterday, and we had another low pressure coming across the UK, and this one tracked a little bit further south. And it actually, well, it's still across us at the moment, but it moved eastwards across kind of central parts of the UK. And it did bring some severe weather. We had some intense thunderstorms, large hail, some strong winds, and also some heavy rain in association with it. In fact, we had a number of warnings, particularly across parts of the south and west. But it wasn't anywhere near as impactful as Storm Éowyn, and so we didn't name it. Even though there were some impacts and the low itself was coming more across central parts, it wasn't as severe. And part of the reason being the position, but also the fact that it wasn't as deep an area of low pressure. It reached around 962 hectopascals as it was reaching Ireland, and about 966 as it made its way towards Wales. So significantly less intense of a feature compared to Storm Éowyn. That being said, it was named, but this time by the Spanish Met Service. So they named it Herminia. And it's because they had some very strong winds, some heavy rain piling into western parts of France, but also to parts of Spain and Portugal as well. Now here's where things get a little bit confusing. And if we put the pressure sequence up, this is from midday today, or 1 o'clock today. And this is the low. This is the low that is Herminia. It's still bringing some heavy rain, some heavy thundery downpours across parts of the UK through today, but it is clearing away towards the east. And as it does so, the Free University in Berlin has actually named it Ivo. I'll come back to that in a second. So in Germany, they use their own naming system, don't tie in with any of the naming groups across Europe, but they've named it Ivo, which is confusing because this feature has also been named Ivo. So if I just go back and if I get rid of the jet stream and put rain on instead, and as we go through the rest of today, I'm just going to put the UK over here so I'm not standing in the way. And as we go through the rest of today and overnight into Wednesday, there's another deep area of low pressure that's coming, and it's going to push its way just to the south of the UK. And it's always worth bearing in mind that with these low pressure systems, the strongest winds are towards the south. If I put the winds on for a second, you can see those strong winds coming to the south. So really for the UK, we're not going to see much in the way of windy weather associated with that. But it's pushing eastwards towards France, and then as it goes, well, southeastwards across France. And now this feature has also been named, but this time it's been named by the Portuguese Met Service because it's bringing some very strong damaging winds to parts of Portugal, also to parts of Spain and France as well, but in Portugal, that's where they've named it. They've named this Ivo. So this area of low pressure is called Ivo. If you speak to many places, we do use the namings that Portuguese, Spanish, French, that they choose as well. So yes, this is technically Storm Ivo, albeit not causing much in the way of strong winds for the UK, but it is. But so is this low pressure if you talk to Germany. So that's a little bit confusing. From our point of view, this is Herminia and this is Ivo. But yeah, there is a little bit of mixed messaging going on there at the moment. However, as we go forward, I do want to highlight, actually, let's go to the UK view, because whilst I mentioned it's not bringing much in the way of strong winds for the UK, we are going to see some heavy rain pushing across southern parts as we go through, well, overnight tonight and into tomorrow. Now, there's always been a bit of uncertainty as to exactly how far north this rain is going to get, but I think we're getting a bit more confident in the idea that we're going to see some heavy rain pushing initially across parts of the southwest. But if I just pause it here, you can see it's really just southernmost counties, just about staying to the south of London, but it could push a little bit further north as we go through Wednesday. And so a wet picture there, but elsewhere actually a decent amount of fine weather, albeit some fairly frequent showers across parts of Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland. So this is in association with Storm Ivo, albeit it's not really a storm from our point of view. But in case you hear that name being battered around, that's why, because the worst of it is staying way to the south, and that's why it's been named by the Portuguese Met Service. But in terms of this, I mentioned that there has been some uncertainty about rainfall amounts, and if we look at 24-hour rainfall totals from a couple of model runs, and we have the Met Office on the left, ECMWF, the European model in the middle, and GFS, the American model on the right, and you can see the highest rain totals from our current model has it really just fringing the south coast of Devon and Cornwall, and then more towards Dorset, Hampshire, and further east towards Sussex and Kent. Similar position from ECMWF. GFS, though, was ever so slightly different with its position, more keeping the heavier rain towards the southwest rather than the southeast. So some uncertainty, but as we've got nearer the time, greater agreement with the idea that something like this, so heavy rain across the far south, southeast. Rainfall totals will build up. They shouldn't cause too many issues, but we could see some localised issues, some flooding. Now, we also mentioned that we have some fairly frequent showers across, I'll get there eventually, across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. But not only are they going to be rain, they're also going to bring some sleet and snow. And we can see that if we look at our freezing level, if I dart ahead to tomorrow at 6 a.m, and the freezing level is the height above sea level where we have the 0 degrees, isotherm 0 degrees. So anything above this is, well, below freezing, anything below is above freezing. And you can see the freezing level over parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's dropping to around 400-600 metres, a little bit lower perhaps in some places. And so that means above maybe 200-300 metres tomorrow, any of those showers are quite likely to be falling as sleet or snow. So a bit of snow. Nothing unusual for the time of year, it's the middle of winter, but yeah, a bit of snow over the higher ground towards the north, much milder than this further south, freezing level around 1,000-1,200 metres, that kind of thing. Then, let's look further ahead, and what else did I want to cover? Yes, let's go through the rest of this week then, and to do that I'm going to use the pressure pattern. Let's dart ahead to, actually let's go back to Wednesday. And I'm going to get rid of the jet stream and put the rain on instead because I find it easier. I'm just going to move the UK there just so you can see it better. And so yes, this is Storm Ivo bringing some wet weather towards the south as we go through Wednesday, but then it eventually clears away. I think through Wednesday night into Friday, a couple of things that we need to be aware of. There will still be rain fringing far southeastern parts. That may take a little while to clear away, so it could be a bit of a damp start in the far southeast. And there are going to be quite a few showers around, but the bigger talking point is this high pressure that's building in. High pressure means things are going to settle down, so it looks like quite a quiet night Wednesday into Thursday. With that, we could get a touch of frost in places where we get any clear skies. There's going to be more cloud the closer you are to this system, this weather system, this rain towards the south. So some southern parts clinging onto some cloudy skies. But yeah, there will be a touch of frost, maybe even a few pockets of fog, freezing fog, that kind of thing, first thing on Thursday morning. But otherwise, Thursday itself is looking like a largely decent day for many places. Just a few showers, though not a particularly large number of these, to be honest, for most places. Then we do get another weather system coming through. It's a front making its way eastwards as we go through overnight Thursday into Friday. It's going to bring some rain, but not a huge amount. If we actually look on the UK picture, and I'm not a fan of the 4-ups, let's go with this view. And if we go through, so you can see some heavy rain pushing into parts of Scotland, but it moves through quite quickly, and as the system makes its way towards the southeast, as we go through towards Friday lunchtime, it kind of breaks up. So there will be some heavier bursts of rain, but it should move through fairly quickly. And so just to dart back to Thursday, like I said, Thursday looks pretty fine for many places, just a few showers around, and we keep with that towards the southeast until lunchtime on Friday when that system comes through. But then there's more fine weather falling in behind because we have another ridge of high pressure building. So if I go back to our pressure pattern, I've clicked the wrong button. And if I go back to Friday, and you can see there's another ridge of high pressure coming in behind the front, and so that should settle the weather down again for a little period of time. But that doesn't last particularly long as we go into the weekend. And if I dart forward, and we have two things. Well, so notice the jet stream, it's driving an area of low pressure quite far to the northwest of the UK, but driving an area of low pressure, and that heads northwards. And so then the talking point is that we're going to end up kind of sandwiched in between low pressure towards the northwest of us and high pressure somewhere towards the south. As we go through the weekend, we're going to have another area of high pressure building from the southwest. So that's going to be dominating the story as we go into Sunday across parts of the southwest. But meanwhile, the jet stream's then driving another area of low pressure. And this one looks like it's going to track a little bit closer to the UK. And so it looks like we're going to have low pressure to the north, high pressure to the south. And that is the perfect ingredients, or the perfect ingredients for us to get quite a westerly flow coming across the UK. And westerly flow brings a lot of unsettled weather, mainly towards northern northwestern parts. I think that's where we're going to see the wettest weather as we go through next week. Meanwhile, towards the south-southeast, a greater chance of seeing the higher pressure being more dominant, so drier here. That does bring other hazards with it. We're talking some more frost, some more fog as we go through the next 2 weeks or so, but it's towards the north-northwest where we're going to have a wet picture. And really, with low pressure to the north, high pressure to the south, this westerly flow, well, that's quite a talking point. That's what we're likely to see quite a lot of as we go through the next 3 months. Now, we have just issued our 3-month outlook. Remember, our 3-month outlooks give an idea of what is most likely to happen weather-wise as we go through the next 3 months. So I have the most recent one here. This looks at February, March and April, and it highlights a couple of things. To look at this in a little bit more detail and to understand how we came up with this, I'm joined now by Deputy Chief Meteorologist Chris Bulmer. Thanks, Chris, for joining me. For those of you who are regular deep dive viewers, you may remember, Chris, we had a look at the winter outlook when it came out at the end of November, but now we're talking February, March and April. And what does it show? We have a lot of statistics behind us.
Yeah, okay, so this is the latest 3-month outlook which we've issued. So these probabilities are for February, March and April. And just a kind of reminder what this is showing, so we compare our seasonal forecast to climate, and we put that into kind of 5 bins, quintiles we call them. And so we look at the forecast and work out kind of how the distribution of the forecast compares to the distribution of climate. So in simple terms, in these numbers here, if we've got a forecast which is just mimicking climatology, so there's not really any signal, for all these boxes we would see 20, 60, 20%.
So in an average 3-month period, we'd be looking at 20% colder than average, 60% warmer than average, 20% milder than average for the forecast.
If there wasn't really any signal.
Yeah,
okay.
I get you. If there was no signal, and that's the same for both temperature, rainfall and strength of wind. But these numbers are very different to that.
Yes.
On this column, they're a lot higher. So there's a fairly strong signal for milder, wetter and windier.
Yeah, so we can see there's definitely a shift towards mild, wet and windy. It's quite normal with background climate change that we see a shift towards mild. But actually for this seasonal forecast, probably what is more notable is we've got quite a strong shift towards wet and windy. So that kind of signal is stronger than we would normally see. So that suggests for the UK for this 3-month period, February, March and April, there's a greater likelihood of conditions being wetter than average and windier than average.
And in fact, wetter and windier, the chance of that is they're both higher than near average, which is quite unusual for these 3-month outlooks, isn't it?
It is, yeah. That's a kind of stronger signal than we normally see when we're doing these.
So why is this happening? You've sent me a couple of charts. Let's look at this one. So these are sea surface temperature anomalies. Looking at, so just to gather it, so this is a map, obviously, of the world. We have Australia here, Asia, North and South America. We're here, but what are we drawing from this?
Well, just kind of before we talk about this, I guess putting the forecast together, we use models, we use our seasonal models like we do for kind of shorter range weather predictions. But with that, we also know, we look at things called teleconnections. There's a range of teleconnections, so remote influences from different parts of the globe that can influence the distribution of weather patterns for areas like the UK and across the North Atlantic. One that many people are aware of is the El Niño Southern Oscillation. And that one of the key things about that is it has 2 key phases, El Niño and La Niña. El Niño, what we had last winter, that's the kind of what is known as the warm phase of the Pacific, and La Niña, which we've kind of currently got, more than a second, is the cool phase of the Pacific. So if we look at, as you pointed out, the map which we've got on here, this is a map of sea surface temperature anomalies. And so we can see across the central parts of the Pacific, these blues are showing us that we're around about a degree or so, or maybe a little bit less than that on average, but there's temperatures around kind of a half a degree to a degree below average in these areas. And you've got these boxes drawn on, so this box called Nino 3.4, this is where we kind of track the index. So when you get a certain strength of anomaly, that's when you kind of can suggest that this has got a La Niña pattern. And one thing that's important is we've got colder than average sea surface temperatures in this area, and then kind of around Indonesia, what we call the maritime continent, it's warmer than average. And in the tropical areas, higher than average sea surface temperature tends to mean more showers and thunderstorm activity. And this pattern will persist for the next few months, which means we'll see more showers and thunderstorms across this area and fewer across this area. And why that's important is we know that has a remote influence on the weather patterns across the North Atlantic. And what that means for the UK is, well, it doesn't give us a kind of definite answer about the seasonal forecast. We know when we've got a La Niña state, during late winter, research has shown that favours wetter and windier, milder than average conditions. So that's consistent with what the models are showing us at the moment.
And this is a similar idea to what we did discuss when we were looking at the 3-month winter outlook. Before, we suggested that towards the end of winter, which we're now heading towards, this kind of setup would be. So it's going relatively to plan. What does this chart show?
Yeah, well, so ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation Index, is just one thing that we're looking at. There's lots of different variables which influence the seasonal forecast. Another big topic, hot topic if you like, in the winter is what's going on in the stratosphere. So some viewers will be aware of the term sudden stratospheric warmings. And once those occur, they're often associated with potentially severe cold outbreaks across Northern Europe. So this chart we're looking at here at the moment is a measure of winds in the stratosphere. So the stratosphere is the layer of the atmosphere above the troposphere where we live and where our weather is. And these lines, so the red line is the forecast strength of the stratospheric polar vortex. This is the strength of the winds in the layer at our latitudes above the troposphere. And at the moment they're much stronger in a westerly phase, much stronger than the climatological average.
So the blue line's climatological average and the red line's the forecast for February and March.
Exactly.
And the winds are, particularly to start with, are much higher. And so that signals that an SSW's unlikely.
Yeah, so that interacts with the jet stream, which is at the top of the troposphere. And what that means is that that's favouring a stronger than average jet stream. And as you pointed to, there's the odd projection from our ensemble, so we've run the forecast many times, that shows a significant weakening of these westerly winds. But really the main signal is that we're going to see stronger than average westerly winds within the stratosphere as we go through the late winter. So a very low chance of a sudden stratospheric warming at this stage.
And then the winds kind of, well, they drop as we go through deeper into spring, and that's normal, right?
Completely typical. Within the stratosphere, the stratospheric polar vortex is a winter phenomenon, so it spins up in the winter, and then once you get into the summer, that actually completely breaks down and you get a reversal of the winds in the stratosphere. So we always see a final warming and a reversal of the stratospheric winds at some point in the spring, but that doesn't tend to have anywhere near the kind of influences these sudden stratospheric warmings, which is something we watch out for during the winter.
So back to the UK, and this is mean sea level pressure anomaly. Pressure at mean sea level anomaly, and we're looking at higher than average pressure towards the south and lower than average pressure towards the north. This is for February, March and April, and so westerlies.
Yeah, it's important how we interpret this chart. So we have to think about where there is skill in these models at this kind of lead time. Trying to work out exactly where low pressures are going to track, whether they're going to track across the UK or whether they're going to be up to the north of the UK. We don't really have that skill, but one thing we do know is the seasonal models do have skill in predicting the phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation. So that's the pressure gradient between Iceland and the Azores down here. So typically, or normally, we have lower pressure up here and higher pressure down here. So we normally have westerly winds in the UK. What this is telling us is we're going to have, well, this forecast suggests we'll have for the full 3-month period, we'll have lower than average pressure across or near Iceland and higher than average pressure across the Azores. So that's pointing to, for that 3-month period, favouring a positive phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation.
So even stronger westerlies.
So even stronger westerlies or more persistent westerlies, and so that means, again, consistent with what we talk about, there's an increased likelihood of spells of wetter and windier weather and generally milder than average conditions. But one thing that is really difficult to pull out of these charts, because this is for the full February, March and April, is whether those low pressure systems will be the kind of severe lows which track across the UK or whether they track to the north. So it could still bring bouts of kind of wet and windy weather, but kind of more typical and less severe than some of the weather we've seen recently.
So whilst it is going to be, or it's likely to be wet and windy through a large chunk of the next 3 months, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see many storms, doesn't necessarily mean we'll see the repeat of anything like Storm Éowyn, but we could have something called storm clustering. What's that? Well,
yeah, so I think based on this pattern, it means compared to the normal risks, the risk of disruptive windstorms is higher than normal for the next 3 months. That's what we can tell from this chart. But yeah, and you mentioned there, this kind of idea, once we get into patterns, you can see these low pressure systems repeatedly move over the UK. So there is an increased risk of that as we go through, particularly February and March, but it's very difficult at this stage to kind of pin down on that.
So storm clustering is when you get like a couple or a few storms coming one after the other over just like a few days, a week or so, which is kind of similar to what we've had recently. I know we didn't name 2 of them, but with Storm Éowyn, then followed by Herminia and then Ivo, quite close to the UK, that's a storm clustering.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, people that live in the UK know that our weather patterns are forever changing, but they often get stuck in a rut for a week or two. So once they're in a strong positive NAO phase, it does mean that there's a chance that we'll see kind of repeated low pressure systems run across the UK, kind of, repeated after themselves. I mean, we're not saying that will definitely happen, but there's a greater chance of that happening in the next couple of months.
And I think one final thing that we do need to point out, whilst wetter, windier, milder than average is significantly more likely, that definitely doesn't mean that we won't get any colder spells. We could have some wintry weather. There could be some colder periods as well mixed in with that. Just the general trend, when we look back at the 3 months that are coming up, that's what we're going to see: wetter, windier, milder.
Absolutely. It's still late winter, so we don't rule out any colder spells. And also this chart we've not really talked about, it's got higher than average pressure kind of across and to the south of the UK. So kind of this, if we kind of read this pattern, it suggests that the wetter weather will probably be more focused on the north and northwest of the country. So there will very likely be still some periods of dry weather, especially across the south. So as ever with the UK weather, we'll see variability through the next 3 months.
But this pattern, that's very much how it's looking for the next, well, as we go through much of next week, to be honest. I'll be doing the 14-day outlook shortly, which will go on the app. And so I'll be updating that, talking about basically this kind of pattern. But do check that out later on this evening if you'd like to know more about the 14 days. Thanks so much for joining me, Chris. I did say I'd get you back, and I did. But I'm looking forward to you joining me once more. We can talk 3-month outlook or another topic. You can choose. Now, as well as the influence on the UK, these teleconnections that Chris mentioned do have an influence on other parts of the world. Now, he mentioned the fact that there are some higher than average sea surface temperatures at the moment across parts of Asia, and that has caused some major problems with regards to rainfall. So in Indonesia, Malaysia and Brunei, they're having some intense thundery downpours. They've seen rainfall totals really building up. I'm just going to get there. Here we go. Rainfall totals building up, and they're going to see more heavy thundery rain through the next few days. We're talking 100 to 150 millimetres in just a day. Some places seeing 350, 400 millimetres building up. There have already been some major landslides with a number of fatalities. There's been some significant flooding, and there is more of this to come. And as Chris highlighted, we could see more of this as we go through the next few weeks, really, because of the setup that we have going on. And it's just interesting how the weather going on around the world can influence the UK in one way and then influence a different part of the world in a completely different way. And so it's just fascinating looking at all this. Now, thanks very much for joining me for this deep dive. I think that's everything that I wanted to cover for you. Like I said, the 14-day outlook will be updated on our app later on this evening, so do check that out. Honor will be here with the 10-day trend tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll see you again soon, but don't forget to hit like, share, and leave a comment as well. Bye-bye.